I was walking on the road. A dusty road just like the one at home. On both sides of the road were trees. They stood tall and thick as far as they went. I was walking on this dusty road, really, with most of my toes bleeding. I was hobbling. Once in a while I would look back at my footprints, and I would grieve to myself that these footprints would soon be washed away by the waters of the rain, or they would soon be swept away by the broom of the wind. Behind young Legson Kayiras lay his village, his parents, his people. Ahead lay thousands of miles of Africa, and a great ocean, and then an unknown land, a land called America. Legson Kayiras grieved for the past, but he moved indomitably toward the future. In his own words, this is the story of his amazing journey. 1 MV life in Africa. Early days. Sometime during the middle 30s, a young man by the name of Timothy Mwenekinyonyo Mwamalopa Aranani Kwawoka Kayiras went to live with his mother's people in a little village called Mpale in the hills of the Karanga district in the northern part of Nyasaland. Not too long before, the young man had lost his father, and a short time after the death of his father, his mother too. Timothy was never taught the art of writing or reading or any worthwhile trade, but he was a hard worker. His mother's people, whose name is Kanyimbo, were kind people. They were neither rich nor poor, but they usually had enough to eat, and enough left over to feed an extra stomach. So, they took the young man in. By the end of the 30s or the beginning of the 40s, Timothy was old enough to get married and take care of himself. He met a young woman whose family had just settled in the village. Her name was Zia Nyakawanga, and her family was on the same social level as that of the Kanyimbos. According to the custom better known as Labora, a person who wants to marry has to give so many cows to the parents of the girl he intends to marry. Now here was Timothy with neither cows nor money with which to buy the cows so he could get married. His mother's people had cows, but they too had sons who would be getting married. But they were kind people. They gave him 10 cows and he got married. That same young man, Timothy, and that same young woman, Zia, became my parents. Although my father was now married, he had not yet paid his in-laws all the cows, and I remember that even at the time when I was already a big boy, my mother's folk used to ask him for the remaining cows and threatened to sue him if he did not pay up. But he never gave them to them for the simple reason that he did not have any and had no way of getting any. He was a poor man. Gossip had it that so poor a man was he that in his whole lifetime he paid his poll tax only once. The headman of the village, seeing that my father could hardly find money for tax, declared to the tax collector that he was dead, and thus he saved him tax for the rest of his life. To the tax collector and to the government he was dead, but to us he was still living. However, this peculiar exemption from tax did not put my father at ease. Indeed, it put him in great difficulty, for it gave him the task of avoiding the tax collector, who had the nasty habit of making surprise visits to the villages. I did not have the slightest idea when I was born. Either it was at the end of the 30s or the beginning of the 40s. I do not know, but I know this. I was born, and that is what counts. To a Westerner, it sounds strange that one should not know when he was born. To him, it is insufficient just to know that he was born. He knows down to the last second just when it was. My parents, being illiterate, never knew how old they were. I can only say that since I was born, it follows that I was born during one of the 12 months and one of the days of the year, and each year as I ride the planet, drifting on its highway around, I pass my time indicator registering how many times I have thus gone around, but I never know I am passing it and have no way of knowing. Lucky is the horse, then, for his teeth tell his physician how old he is, while mine remain mute. I remember much later, when I grew up, I asked my mother if she could give me some clue as to when I was born, telling me some major events that occurred at or around that time. Events that I would be able to trace so I could have some idea about the year to night during the season when people harvest. This let me argue with myself whether it made any difference to be born in May or June, the months of harvest. But as to what date or what year I could not tell, for the season has many nights and all of them are alike and, moreover, people harvest every year. I never can say that I saw the hut in which I was born, for being old and in very bad repair, it had been pulled down long before my mind was sensitive enough to record and store a picture of it. I have, however, seen the place on which it was built, a small round place not measuring 7 feet in radius. It was built in a relatively small village about half a mile west of a small river called Didymu. I understand I was big and fat as a child and too heavy for my mother, who had to carry me around on her back. Inexperienced in handling her first child, and a heavy one. She decided to get rid of me by throwing me into the waters of Didymu. She did, and marched home with a light back and apparently no sense of guilt or lack of self-respect any more than a girl who today realizes that her relations with some boys have gone too far and decides to abandon the result to some home. But for my mother, it was a different story. No sooner had she gotten to the house than an elder woman, carrying in her hands a baby whom she had just fished out of the water, came running, screaming, shouting and cursing, announcing to the rest of the villagers the unheard of thing. Woman threw away her baby. Now look here, you are stupid. The women in the village reprimanded my mother, pointing their fingers at her. Look here, when a canyon gave your father 10 cows, and then you throw away his baby. You. After some beating from my father and frightened of what would follow if she repeated the offense, my mother welcomed me back to her. On that day I was 7, the name of Didymu as my first name, commemorating the name of the river in which I was tossed. 2 or 3 years later I had a brother. His name was Tennyson, the only one in our family who had a foreign name right from the start. I remember, when he was about 3 years or so, a certain man by the name of Nyando gave us a puppy. Since we had no cows ourselves and hence no way of getting milk to feed this little animal, Mr. Nyando agreed to let us bring the puppy to his house every morning and every evening, and there he would give us the milk or we would let it suck from its mommy. My brother liked the puppy and he never forgot once to take it. One day, he came home crying. He did not have the puppy and as far as I can recall, I never really learned what had happened to it. About a week later my brother was ill, and one evening during that week he died. My father, one of the people who strongly believed that witchcraft existed, was not slow to admit that Tennyson had been bewitched. His belief was quickly confirmed, he thought, by the fact that before Tennyson was buried a group of old men in the village, with some sharpened sticks and reeds, had cut open my dead brother's stomach in order to determine what really killed him. They found that the bile in his gallbladder was black. Well, they said to one another, nodding their heads in agreement, with one corner of their mouths turned down, "This is black bile." Well, that's witchcraft. It was only a matter of weeks after the death of my brother that I was struck down by a mild cold. My parents lost no time in carrying me to a medicine man who lived several miles away. They could have taken me to my grandfather, my mother's father, who was also a celebrated medicine man, but they feared that his medicine would not be very effective on one so close to him. The doctor they carried me to was fairly old, not so tall as my grandfather, who stood close to 7 feet. He had a short beard scattered over his chin and short curly hair, gray almost white, suggesting he had seen a good many harvests. Chewing some leaves, he listened patiently as my father explained his troubles to him. "You see, doctor," my father began, "I had 2 children, and one of them just died this last month. Now this one is ill, and I have brought him to you so you can give him some medicine. Time. There's a bad man in your village," he added, very careful not to mention any name, "who is planning to kill all of you." My father was frightened at these words and looked as if he had never been told before that someday he would die. "Help me, sir, help me, please," he pleaded. Although I was still young at that time, I can still see the whole scene in my mind. The doctor seated there, listening to the pleadings of my worried father. My father, whose frame at its straightest measured not quite 5 feet, was sitting on a stool. An old black cloth hanging over his left shoulder gave him the pose of a Roman senator, a frightened one. His hair, black and short, made him look like a boy when compared to the doctor's. His front teeth were filed, and they had the shape of a V. On his chin was a long black goat-like beard, of which he was very proud. "Well," the doctor paused, then sighed. "I shall give him medicine that will protect him from any witchcraft, but before I do, I will ask him to promise he will follow the conditions I shall give him along with the medicine. These conditions are important, very important. If he breaks them, the medicine will be useless." My father exaggerated the doctor's statement by saying to me, "If you don't promise, you will die in 2 weeks." I hope I will not be condemned when I say that I feared death so much I would do anything I believed would immunize me. I therefore promised the doctor I would follow his almost impossible conditions. My parents and they rejoiced at my promise and called me a good, my child. The doctor proceeded, "Here are the conditions. You shall never eat any mushrooms, you shall never eat the meat of a buffalo, you shall never eat any food that shall have been prepared by some person not related to you." There were about a dozen of them. This, I thought, is one good way of telling someone to starve himself to death, but I had agreed I would obey these 5 conditions. After making a good many cuts on my chest, back, elbows, and thighs, and wiping some black powder on them, the doctor spat on my bare belly and then on my face. Patting me on the shoulders, he said, "Now, if you follow these conditions, there will not be any witch in this area who will have wit enough to find and bewitch you." Then he let out a short giggle and added, "And you will live to be as old as I am, or older." He gave my father some roots and ordered him to have them buried near the doorpost in our house. This supposed to ward off witches. Later on, he became our family doctor. We consulted him on every matter concerning our health, and on the several occasions he would visit our home, we would give him the best possible treatment. I have mentioned witchcraft not only because my father strongly believed in it, but also because it was a popular practice at the time, and still is, though it is not so pronounced as before. The witches were supposed to be bad people, people who could magically strike and kill a person at will, and they were the people we were supposed to fear and avoid. On the other hand, were the medicine men, who were supposed to be good people, prophets inspired by divine forces to control the power of the witches or to get rid of them. These were the people we were supposed to respect and admire. Around that year I had a sister, and she was named Nthope, meaning that the one preceding her in time was dead. My father took too much to drinking, and whenever he was drunk, he and mother would fight. The funny thing is that my mother brewed the beer for him, and normally he would invite his friends, and they would sit down and drink all day. It was a good omen on such a day because when they were all drunk, they would amuse one another by singing or dancing, and he would not fight. But when he was the only drunk person, I seldom went into the house. He would sing, or he would command. No, my mother would now do this, now that get tired of his noise and ask him to be quiet for a change, and then they would be at each other. My mother, towering almost a foot higher than my father when they both six stood straight, and with a frame much more impressive, would say, "I say, stop this. Are you kidding? Who do you think you are, commanding me?" "Me," my father would ask, pointing his fingers at his chest. Indeed, during such times my father felt like a king in the village, and nobody could order him around. I feared that if a tax collector ever appeared in the village at one of these times, my father would order him to leave right away. In fact, on one occasion he and others, including my mother's uncle, the great Njejo, were drinking. My father turned around and, looking at the bald-headed Njejo, said, "My, your little eyes are just as ugly as your mother's." Of course, he had never seen Njejo's mother, who had died long before my father was born. Njejo jumped into the house for a hoe handle, but my father had wits left in him to propel him away before the angry old man returned. When they were fighting, my mother usually would bite him. They both had filed front teeth, but mother's were not so sharp. At times he would ask me to sit down in front of him, with a small pot of beer immediately in front of him, and a straw made of some kind of a grass in one hand. He would teach me to write figure 6. This evidently was the only figure he knew, for he kept on teaching it to me over and over. Sometimes he would invite me to have a little drink. "Not even a little bit?" "Oh, sure, you will drink it," he would say if I refused his offer. "What will you do when I am dead?" he would ask. "You know, I will always be asking you for beer, and if you don't give me any, I shall kill all your children," he would say, with a wide smile revealing his beautiful V teeth, and with one hand playing with his beard. This killing of my children if I did not give him any beer when he was dead was a reference to a belief that some people had. They were supposed to place some pots of beer on the graves of their deceased relatives, and if they did not, a calamity would befall them. There were many other boys in the village, and like most of them I wore no clothes except a piece of string 7 tied around my waist, and a piece of cloth about 5 inches long and about 3 inches wide hanging on the string on my front, thus hiding my nakedness. Many was the day when I would lose the cloth and run around the village with nothing on at all, and we never ashamed. My father, who could make very beautiful baskets, was sometimes able to sell them and get sufficient money to buy himself and mother a piece of cloth. Normally he would buy black, durable cotton fabrics, and my parents would wear them for 3 or 4 years before the cloths were in such tatters that it was almost impossible to pin the pieces together. Then my father would begin worrying and, one way or another, would get a cloth for my mother. Those who had cows were lucky because they could sell some of them and buy clothes. But my family was not that blessed. We never complained about our poverty, and indeed, there was nobody to whom we could complain. I was always proud that we had enough to eat, that all the food we ate was ours, produced by our own labor in our own garden. We never begged for any food. If only my father had been taught some worthwhile trade, hard worker that he was, I am sure that we would never have been so poor. He could make baskets, but so could almost everyone else in the village, and very few people cared about buying baskets, because they could also make them. Anyway, I believe that there have to be poverty if there is to be wealth, because I believe that there is no society where all people are the richest. In fact, if such a society exists, there will still be some who will be richer than others, although they are all rich, and those who are less rich than the others will correctly be designated as poor in that particular society. At that time, boys and girls in our area started school when they were in their teens. The boys who were still young and those who did not like to go to school were charged with taking care of the cows. Girls did not have to look after cows. You will recall that I said we did not have any cows in my family. My mother's brother, Fred Kawanga, was such a lazy fellow that he liked neither to go to school nor to look after his father's cows. The cows ate my father gave them when he married my mother. I was to look after them myself, and I liked doing so, especially when my grandfather would tell me that when I grew up, they would all be mine. They aren't yet. Then all the boys in there were sleeping in a barn, the same barn in which the cows slept. It was a big barn built of wood and grass thatched like the regular houses or huts in the villages. Inside this barn was a row of pillars set about 3 feet from one another, and this row of pillars divided the barn into 2 sections lengthwise, separating our sleeping place from that of the cattle. The cows section was built in such a way that it was slightly sloping so that when the cows were tied to the pillars at night, their tails would be on the lower part of the floor. This was meant to let the cows' water flow out of the barn instead of into our sleeping place. This did not help much because although the cows were tied to the pillars, some would get loose and wander to our section, pass their water or dung on us, and sometimes eat our little pieces of cloth. Besides, they were awfully noisy at night. Some would endlessly snore, others continuously chewed cud, and still others breathed so loud and so violently that we would sometimes scream, thinking a wild animal was outside. The nights were cool, and to keep ourselves warm we had a fire. To be able to keep the fire burning, we, of course, needed firewood. We made a law for ourselves that everybody would bring firewood each evening. The first offense was to prohibit the offender from sleeping near the fire that night, and a repeated offense was punishable by dismissal from the barn. The general view at that time was that it was immoral for a boy to sleep in the same house with his parents, and if one did, we used to laugh at him and call him all sorts of names. There were limits to this. We would not laugh at one or call one names if he was seriously ill and had to sleep with his parents. Fights among boys were very common. Sometimes we even had competitions, and boys from one village would fight boys from other villages. I always enjoyed watching these fights, but I never liked fighting myself because I was always beaten. We would be forced by the older boys 9 in the village to fight hard so our village would win, but I did not like to be forced to fight, and the best I could do was run away from home. But I could not keep on running away all the time, so I had to learn to fight too. Aside from those frequent fights, we were very happy. Many times, we would play hide and seek, or we would bury one another in the sand and see who stayed under the sand longest. Of course, we had no way of telling how long one of us stayed there because we had no watches. The winner was given a prize, and prizes varied from day to day. Only once did I stay under the sand longer than anyone else, and I was to be given a grand prize, a ride home on a cow's back instead of walking. This was a prize all right, but I was too small to jump on the cow's back without any help, and the boys were not cooperative. If I stood on a higher place such as a stone or a stump, I thought I would be able to jump on the cow's back as it passed by. This I did, and it worked beautifully, except that I jumped too high and landed on the other side of the cow. If it were a jumping contest, I probably would have won, considering how high I went. When I hit the ground, a small piece of wood about 1 inch long pierced my left leg, and it is still there. I have never thought of having it removed. I guess I will let it stay. One of the people I was very fond of was my grandfather, my mother's father. Tukwi Kawanga was his name. I do not remember my grandmother very well because she died when I was SD1T very young. He had once given me some medicine that he claimed would protect me against all snake bites except that of a black mamba. His conditions, unlike those of our family medicine man, were simple. I would not kill a snake, and I would not jump across a dead snake. One day, he suddenly picked up his belongings, including the cows, and moved to Deep Bay about 100 miles away by road. The reason for his sudden move was simple too. His older and only brother was ill and was being moved into our village where his sister Nakaro Nai Kawanga would look after him. My grandfather was a very impatient man and, in a way, very inflexible. Early in the century, when his brother Mjejo Kawanga and he were young men, they 10 had a quarrel. a very heated one. They had come to blows and Tukwi was thoroughly beaten. He had been knocked to the ground, and with his mouth and nose bleeding, he rose, spat blood, and shouted, "Now look at me, you big boy. Look at me." His brother, bemused by his victory, turned his head and grinned proudly at his young brother. "Now," Tukwi declared, "you and I shall never see each other until the judgment day." Saying this, he picked up his spear and his axe and went away. They never saw each other again, although Mjejo as late as the 40s made many desperate attempts through some mediators to see if his brother would change his mind. Even now that Mjejo has been dead for some 14 years, my grandfather cannot go to the place where the house in which his brother died was built, because he believes that since that was the last place his brother had been in, his soul might still be lingering there. He cannot set foot there, let alone see his grave. So, when he moved to Deep Bay, I had no cows to look after, but I still continued to go out into the fields so I could play with the other boys. I must have been about 7 then. My mother had a baby boy. He was named Kamuntu, meaning a small man. There were now 3 children in our family: my sister, Nthope, who was quite grown up by then, Kamuntu, and myself. But not very long after the birth of Kamuntu, my mother became very ill, so ill that we all lost hope she would ever recover. My father moved her, together with Nthope and the baby, to our doctor high up on a hill. I was left alone at home, and I was given the first test of determining whether or not, and if so, how far I would obey the conditions of my doctor about not eating any food prepared by someone not related to me. Our chief food is sema. Women soak corn in water for several days, then they grind it or pound it in a mortar, and then sieve it, and they get a very fine white flour. They cook it in an open fire, and what comes out is sema. Luckily enough, before my mother became ill, she had enough flour in the house. She left it there, and I was able to prepare my food. At this time, I was sleeping in our house and not in the barn. I was very much afraid of the dark, and a young girl, older than I, by the name of Kalina Kafunda, was asked to sleep with me in our house so she could keep me company. It was during the beginning of the rainy season, the time when we begin to work in our gardens. Since my parents were away, I would have to be responsible for seeing that our garden was hoed and planted in order to be sure of having something to eat the following year. My mother's cousins, there were quite a few of them in the village, promised they would help me in their spare time. Our garden was such a big thing, around 20 acres, that I could not imagine how I was ever going to manage. Every day I would work in it for some few hours, and I would plant every piece of ground that I had hoed. At the end of each day's work, I would go home, prepare something to eat, then go out to play with the other boys. Sometimes my father would come down and work in that garden all day, then go back to the hill. This continued for several weeks until one Saturday morning when I went to work a wee bit later than usual. It was still fairly early. The sun had not yet risen, the wind was blowing very gently, and the leaves on the trees were dancing in a gentle rhythm to the music of the wind. The leaves on the grass, like the leaves on the trees, were shaking and dancing among themselves. The monkeys up on a hill, the hill facing the one where my ailing mother was staying, were quarreling or singing or just plain shouting. I do not know which. I had been at my work for not more than half an hour, and now I was standing up and watching 2 birds chasing each other a short distance from me. I guess one was female and the other male. What an early time for lovers to be chasing each other. Above me, the clouds, dark and thick, were moving slowly, dropping some of their water as they crept toward their destination. I wondered to myself if it was going to rain that day, and I was thus wondering when I heard a faint sound coming from far away. I listened, then listened again, and heard the sound of a drum. I listened still more and heard that it was a drum dispatching the message of death. 12 at home, we have different ways of drumming, and other than the meaningless sounds of drums played by children, many of these ways of drumming have their meanings. One way signifies death, another signifies the presence of danger such as a lion, and so on. I wonder who is dead, I said to myself as I lifted my hoe to resume my work. Then suddenly a thought struck me. Who else is ill? Could it be my ailing mother? I listened again, trying to detect from which direction the sound was coming, and it was certainly coming from the hill where my ailing mother was. I almost fainted. I threw away my hoe and stared at the ground for many minutes. If my mother is dead, I thought as the first tears rolled slowly down my cheeks, what will happen to Kathy's sound was loud and clear now, and its message was becoming clearer to me. I looked up and saw beyond a small river, not Didymu, that lay between our garden and the village, a small boy running toward me as fast as his legs could carry him. I saw him go down into the river and up again on the other side of it. I saw him getting nearer and nearer until he came and stood before me. He looked at me, panting violently, trying to regain his breath. Then he said in a soft voice, "They are calling for you. Come quickly." Now I was certain that my mother was dead. I left my hoe and ran with him to the village. There I found several women and men at our house waiting for me, but they did not tell me anything about my mother. All they said was that they wanted me to go with them and see how she was. I suspected they knew she was dead, but were hiding the fact from me. We walked, and I could hear the chattering of the monkeys on the other hill. They are happy, I thought, but I doubt if they would be happy if they too lost their mothers. As we approached the village, I heard the voices of women weeping, and I followed the people I was with until we got to the house where Mother was. The first person I saw was my mother. My little brother was dead. Evidently my father had left the house at night and gone to some other medicine man in another village so he 13 could get more medicine, for no sooner had we reached the house than he came down, roaring. He resembled even more a Roman senator, a barefoot one, with a spear in one hand, an axe resting on his right shoulder, and a bunch of roots in the other hand. He flung away the roots, the medicine, for they were useless now. Tears rolled down my cheeks as I stared at the sad face of my mother, sitting there and weeping over her child, the second she lay down, sobbing and pleading, "Oh God, I am already dying. Why did you not let me die instead, and let my little child live?" And she kept on pleading as though she expected God to say, "All right, woman, here is your child. He is going to live, and you are going to die right now." She was very thin, and certainly ill. My father was also much thinner than he was the last time I had seen him. My sister was all right, except that when they were taking my brother to the grave, she cried violently, apparently thinking they were throwing him away. I had to hold her with all my might, for she struggled and kicked, almost tearing herself apart. I stayed there with them for about a week. When I returned home, I found that the rest of our garden had been hoed and planted with maize. The people in the village had worked on it as a token condolence. A month later, my mother recovered and came back home. There were no roads in our area at that time, and whenever a white man happened to be passing by, there would be scores of Africans carrying his luggage, and sometimes carrying him. Our chief had received word that a white government official would be visiting our area and the other parts of the district, and he picked out several men from the village to carry his loads. My father was among them. The journey was long and tedious, and it took them a long time before they finally got to our village, as the white man and his carriers were going from village to village, spending a night in each. I had never seen a white person before, and when the day arrived when he was due in our village, hundreds of us stood beside the path, awaiting his arrival. I saw a line of tired men, my father 14 included, all carrying on their shoulders or on their heads chairs, tables, a tent, boxes, and many other things. It looked as though the white man was moving to some other place. Slowly they passed us with no words and no smile on their faces. Behind these men was a suntanned white couple. The man was walking elegantly, not seeming to care about his heavily burdened carriers. His wife was lying luxuriously on a stretcher held by 4 of the strongest men of the group. They passed us, and we followed them until we came to a river where I saw the white man, who did not like to wade across the river, jump up on the back of an African. I watched the bearer as he staggered across the river and wondered what would happen if that man slipped and fell, dropping his burden. But he did not. We followed them still farther to the place where the carriers had set up the tent. I saw the chief bringing a fat bull as a gift to the white man, and other people bringing eggs, chickens, onions, and other gifts. I wondered how really important he was that people would so willingly give him bulls and chickens and other precious things. My mother and others in the village had told us children that he owned the country, and the way they told us it sounded as though not only was he a ruler, but also the creator of our country. Little did I know that he was a foreigner, an exploiter, a man using us and our land for his own advantage under the guise of protecting us. Protecting us against what? Against progress? I did not know that any of those tired black faces, sitting innocently there, had, with the right tools, the right of occupying the office that man and his wife held. Anyway, for the time being I was satisfied with the false belief that he was my master, my mother's master, and every other African's master. The following morning, he and his carriers left our village and went to the next one. When my father and his friends got home, they told us about an incident that happened on the way. My father and 3 others were walking behind the white people, and being tired and hungry, they sat down to rest. One of them was carrying a big fat cooked chicken for the whites. Since they were 15 hungry, he suggested to the others that they should steal a thigh and eat it. They did. My father, who probably enjoyed it more than the others, asked why not just eat it all. Because, he said, we have eaten this thigh, and he is going to beat us because of that. If we eat it all, he is still going to beat us. Why, then, don't we eat it all, seeing that we are going to be beaten either way? And besides, that way he is going to beat us with our stomachs full. They all agreed with him, and they quietly enjoyed the whole chicken and then resumed their walking. The poor white man and his wife were hungry, and they sat down waiting for their food. The men arrived. My food, the European demanded, extending his arm to his food carrier. He got his food, but no chicken. Before he could ask what had happened to it, his food carrier told him they had eaten it. "You poor little devils," the white fellow murmured, ordering them to lie down while he went to fetch his stick. They had a very nice beating on their bare buttocks. We laughed, hearing of 4 such big men as our fathers being beaten by one man, but we advised them not to do it again, lest he shoot you. We were approaching the season of harvest. All the gardens in the area were heavy with maize, and beside each one you could see a man or a woman or a whole family, sitting there patiently all day guarding their gardens against the intrusion of monkeys, who had the nasty habit of coming down the hills to steal maize. Nthope and I would sit beside our garden and scream when the monkeys came down. They would be frightened and would run back or sneak into somebody else's garden. We enjoyed doing this. As for me, I felt somewhat proud to be able to guard a garden that I had worked so hard to prepare. One day, as we were sitting down waiting for the monkeys, Nthope fainted. I did not know what to do. I ran to my mother's cousin, whose garden was next to ours, and begged her to come and help me. She carried my sister back to the village while I remained, in case the monkeys should come down. During the following 3 weeks my sister was sick some days and all right others. Then in the 4th week she began a turn for the worse. One Saturday morning my father left for the medicine 16 man. I went to do my usual job, looking at our garden. My mother stayed at home with my sister. I came home in the afternoon carrying a basket of green maize. I found my mother's aunt, Nakaro Kawanga, holding Nthope on her lap while my mother was sitting with her head supported by her right hand. I saw that she was worried and guessed that my sister had really turned for the worse. My mother handed me a plate of sima which Nakaro had brought her and which she was not able to eat. I sat down and began eating it. Then I heard my sister cough, a sharp, strong cough, and neither my mother nor her aunt nor myself could doubt that she was indeed struggling with death. Her eyes opened and her mouth was still open from the cough. My mother motioned me to leave the room. With a lump of sima in my mouth and another in my hand, I stepped out. I spat out the sima in my mouth and threw away the lump in my hand. As I walked slowly toward a house belonging to one of my mother's cousins, I heard a sharp cry from our house, then another. The 2 women were crying. My sister was dead. Soon there was a big crowd of men and women, and already someone was beating the drum. My father came from the medicine man, carrying in one hand his spear, in the other the bunch of roots, and on his right shoulder, his axe. He flung away the roots as he came into the house, but this time he threw away his spear and his axe as well. Although I was young, I could not fail to be struck by the similarities between the deaths of these 2 children. They died on a Saturday, except that one died in the morning and the other in the evening. They both died when my father was away begging for some medicine, and then, on each occasion, he had flung it away because it was too late. Unable to understand, I walked aimlessly around the area. There was a big noise as the women wept. It being late in the evening, my sister was going to be buried the following morning. That night, in a quiet anger, I wondered why she died. And for that matter, why did 3 members of the family die? I could not answer the question, and I exploded into violent crying and cursing. Oh yes, I even 17 cursed the Lord himself. I had been told many times that there was God who is all good and all kind. Is this what you call kindness? I asked the empty space in front of me, pointing my finger at it as if I saw him there. Is this kindness, letting other people's children die? But that empty space before me did not answer. Tell me. I finally shouted in extreme anger and aroused the attention of the men sleeping in the same room with me. We all die, they comforted me. Of course, some die sooner than others, but sooner or later, we all die. I had known my sister much more than I had known either Tennyson or Kamuntu, and I just could not admit to myself that she was dead. Perhaps, I wildly imagined, God is going to be kind this time and bring her back to life before dawn. But at dawn she was as dead as yesterday. When they were carrying her to be buried, I walked behind that multitude of women and men and could not help but think of the days when she and I played together. I remembered when she had cooked something for her doll, and when her doll would not eat, she became angry, and we laughed at her. She became angrier, like a carpenter who curses when he hits his finger with a hammer, or someone who beats his car because it will not start. She was so angry that she destroyed her doll and even set our house on fire. I remembered the time she saved me a good beating when I had refused to do something my father asked. He was ready to whip me, and my sister came with a stone in hand to stone him if he whipped me. He didn't. Now she was dead, and in a few minutes she would all be buried. Chapter 2 Go to School IT was around 1946 when I first went to school. That same year, we had very late rains. We had waited for weeks and 18 weeks for the coming of rams. There were none. The village headman announced that he had set aside a day when all the people in the village would gather together and ask our ancestors to send us rain. On that sunny morning of the appointed day, all people in the village swept clean their houses and extinguished all the fire according to the custom that had been observed by our people for centuries when praying for rain. Then we all gathered, and the leading men in the village made fire by rubbing 2 sticks together. Drums were drummed, and we danced and cheered, while our leading men said their prayers. Immediately after that, each family took some fire and rushed to their houses. Pretty soon we saw a dark cloud yonder on the horizon, and it slowly spread all over the sky. The lightning flashed and the thunder rolled, and the mountains echoed back, and there was rain. It rained and poured until the rivers were flooding high. Was that rain a result of our prayers, or was it natural? The following morning, when many were collecting their hoes and seeds to go to work in their gardens, I was joining the other boys going to school for the first time. There was a 3-year school run by the Church of Scotland about 3 miles away from home, and their men and women were taught the art of reading and writing and our language, and also some elementary arithmetic such as addition and subtraction. There were many pupils but very few teachers, and it was decided that those who were going to school for the first time should have their classes in the afternoon, and the others in the morning. So, I was placed in the afternoon classes. The school fee was not very high, 6 pennies per year, but it took my parents several months before they were able to sell enough groundnuts to give me this money. At school we had no books, no paper, and no pencils, and we did our work either on the ground with our fingers or on our thighs with a piece of grass or of wood. The teachers had blackboards on which they wrote the work we were supposed to do each day. At the end of the day, we could go home and show our parents what we had done at school. At that time, pupils brought food to the teachers. This 19 was done in tums, and I remember one time when it was my turn, my mother was not home, and when I went to school without the food, I was sent home. The next day I cooked some potatoes and put them in an old dirty basket. The other boys were laughing at my dirty basket as I carried it to school, but the teachers ate all the potatoes and never complained about the basket. Besides bringing food to them, pupils were expected to work in the teachers' gardens or do any other kind of work around their houses. They claimed that since they spent most of their time teaching at school, they had no time left to do their other jobs, and so each day they would send so many pupils to do such jobs. On one occasion, the teacher asked us to bring hose to school the next day, and several of us brought hose as requested, and there were many others who did not bring any. The teacher said that those who had brought hose should give them to those who did not bring them, and that each person should be the overseer of the person to whom he gave the hoe. I gave mine to one of the biggest boys in the group and collected several sticks for myself. He was a hard worker, and he worked as hard as he was able to, but I was never satisfied with his work, and I kept on beating him as he was working until he worked no longer, but simply sat down and cried. Then the teacher announced that those who were working should give back the hose to the owners and be their overseers. I was scared to death at the thought that the boy I had just been beating so much would now be my overseer. What would he do? Was he going to avenge himself? I saw him wipe away his tears and laugh aloud with joy. Well, he collected several sticks, and before he was able to beat me, I ran home and did not show up at school for 3 days. It had been very unnecessary for me to beat him just because he did not work to my satisfaction. Indeed, I believe I did not beat him because he did not work as well as I wanted him to, but because I had power. the power that the teacher had vested in me as an overseer of someone else. Many people have lost their heads because of power, and I lost mine too. 20 few of the boys in the village went to school. Most of them were taking care of the cattle and were therefore unable to find time to go to school. This presented a great problem for me, because I like to play with these boys out in the fields or go out hunting with them instead of going to school. The school itself meant very little to me at that time, and I would have been most happy if there had been no school at all. The teachers, too, seemed like cruel people who could punish or whip when one was late or did not bring food to them, and this discouraged me very much. Although I had been at school for less than a year, I was already tired of it, and I was planning to quit, but my parents insisted that I continue. Not that they knew the value of school more than I did, but because they did not want to waste the 6 pence they had paid for my school fees. With much reluctance, I finished that school year. The following year, there were 6 of us from the village going to school, and there were many others from the surrounding villages. Unfortunately, all 6 of us did not like going to school that year. We were simply forced by our folk. We were able, though, to leave our homes and say we were going to school, while in reality we would stop somewhere on the way and play there all day until late in the afternoon, when we would return home and report we had gone to school. However, things were made difficult for us later on because at school we were given slates, and our parents now wanted us to prove to them each evening that we had gone to school by showing them what we had written at school. In other words, after writing whatever we were supposed to write at school, we would let the teacher mark our slates with his piece of chalk, and we would run home without erasing our slates to prove to them we had gone to school. Then one day one of us made an amazing discovery. It was simple, but it worked for us. You know, fellows, our parents cannot read, our discoverer observed. So, we can hide in the woods again and play, he said. Then toward the end of the afternoon, we can write 21 whatever we please and show it to they'll believe it. But where shall we get chalk to write like a teacher? You know we have to have our slates marked by him. I have that answer too, he said, producing a piece of an old and well-burnt bone. See how it writes? It was written exactly like a piece of white chalk. Now we were able to hide in the woods all day and go home in the evening and still prove to them beyond doubt that we had gone to school. Somehow, they found out that we were not going to school and they punished us. The punishment was not severe, but it was hard enough to teach us to be honest. We had cheated and had cheated nobody but ourselves. Our folk were forcing us to go to school, not for their own sake, but for ours. They were trying to help us prepare for our future, a future that would probably be better than theirs had been. They had never been given an opportunity to go to school themselves, but they knew very well that the knowledge of reading and writing and the ability to use such knowledge made quite a difference between a person who possessed such a knowledge and the one who did not have it. They knew, therefore, that if there was any chance for their children to go to school, they would not let them miss it. Our punishment was that we were made to march around the village all day singing a Zungunziru Apangan Deji. Clever Europeans make airplanes. As we marched, a guard behind us ready to strike if one of us did not keep pace with the others. We were not allowed to stop for food or drink during the long march, and by the time our punishment was over late in the evening, we unanimously promised we would never refuse to go to school again. A rumor went around the village saying that I had been responsible for passing out the information to the parents that we were not going to school, but instead were hiding in the woods and playing, and this did not please the other boys. They decided to punish me, and their punishment was to beat me. When we went out into the woods the following Saturday, they attacked me, but fortunately a relative who had just returned from Burma, where he served during the Second World War, was cutting down some nearby. He was a strong man, and a good many people in the village were afraid of him. He heard my crying and came running to my rescue, and when the boys saw him, they all ran away. In the evening, they were caught and punished. It was not too long before we were reconciled. We went to school together again. On Saturdays, we would go hunt for a fire listening to stories told by our grandmothers. Children, the grandmothers would call out, "Do you see that head on the moon?" Yeah, we would all yell out together. She used to be our neighbor, but one day she worked on Sunday, and God punished her by sending her to the moon. They would tell us. Too bad, we would say with awe. Going to school that year was no longer a hard thing. We loved to go and enjoyed being at school, and we learned, still more, that if we did things that were pleasant to the teachers, we would no longer be punished or whipped, and we made it our duty to do so. However, there was one thing that made us act contrary to our commitments, and this affected all the male pupils in the school. The headmaster decided that all male pupils were to build a road running from the school to the main road, which was being constructed about 2 miles away from the school itself. The road was to pass through a fairly thick forest, and we were to work on the road for over 4 hours a day and be in class for about 2 hours. We started the job, and each day we labored there diligently. But one of the teachers, who was also the village headman, sympathized with our toils, and instead of asking the headmaster to cut down the number of hours that we were putting on building the road each day, he advised us to strike and go home. We were not familiar with strikes, and certainly we were neither ready nor organized for it. But we tried it, and it worked very well. We were in class for 2 hours one morning. Then he sent us to work on the road. He himself remained at school, and while we were 22 on the road, we sent a delegation to him composed of 2 boys, asking him to come and inspect our work. But before he and the 2 boys came, we all ran away. When we returned to school the next morning, he never mentioned anything about the road or about what we had done the previous day, and from that day on we never worked on the road. That was an easy strike, but why did the headmaster abandon the whole project just after one strike? In fact, we did not want to discontinue building the road. We were merely asking him to cut down the number of working hours a day. If all strikes in the world ended like that, business would probably have collapsed already. However, we were happier that way than we would have been otherwise. That school year was a period of happiness and unhappiness, of gratification and disappointments. But we went through it all right, and we were all happy when the summer holidays came. I spent my holiday at home, most of the time hunting wild pigs with older men in the village. I remember late that summer on a sunny Sunday morning, several men and 3 of us boys, armed with spears and dogs, left the village and went hunting up in the hills. We hunted all day but did not see any wild animals. Late in the afternoon, we saw wild pigs. These pigs are good meat, but often they are dangerous, as they charge at people when they are attacked. IHE dogs began chasing them, and we ran behind the dogs. And when the dogs were barking, the pigs stopped to fight the dogs, and we came nearer to spear them, and the pigs ran again, with the dogs following, and us following the dogs, until we were able to kill one of the pigs. We hid the pig in a small river and ran after the others until we were many miles from where we had hidden the one killed. We were unable to kill another one, and being tired, we sat down and rested in an old, deserted house. And there came heavy rain, and it rained all evening, stopping only late at night. Rivers flooded high, and our river quietly swept our pig down the slopes on the side of the hill opposite the one facing our village and deposited it in someone's garden down in the valley. 24 the next morning, finding that our pig was gone, we followed the river all the way down to the valley and found the owner of the garden with his family busy trying to take the pig to their house. It was hard to convince them that the dead pig was really ours, because they hardly believed our story. We threatened them that whether they believed our story or not, we were still going to get back our pig. Realizing that they would never gain anything by arguing, they yielded, and being kind people, we gave them a chunk of meat, about 20 pounds, which was better than nothing. That summer my mother's cousin and her family moved to our village from another village about 100 miles away. Their son, Maynard Sinkind, was as old as I was and became one of my greatest friends. From the day we met in 1948, we played together, went to school together, lived in the same room, and shared our happiness and disappointments until the day we parted after attending Livingstone Secondary School in 1958. In the eyes of the many people who saw us together, we looked like brothers, and not just like plain brothers, but twin brothers. Actually, we did not look much alike, but still there were many people who could not tell immediately who Maynard was and who was Didymu. I owe much to my friend, especially in education. He showed a special interest in mathematics, and this is something I was very weak in, especially during the first few years of school. I remember at one time the teacher, seeing that we were great friends, feared that I would spoil him. The next school year found Maynard and me at another school, called Winya, which was then a junior primary school, situated about 8 miles away from our village. Each morning, we walked to school together, and each evening we walked back home. It was a hard and tedious walk, and we seldom liked it. It became even harder in winter or the rainy season, when sometimes the mornings would be very wet. By the time we got to school, we were very wet, and sometimes it would rain while we were already at school, and rivers would flood, and we would be unable to go back home, so we would have to sleep with other people in other villages. Besides, there were many 25 times when we got to school late, and we were either flogged on our backs or punished, and there were many times when we went home before we were supposed to because we were tired, and we would be subject to the same beatings. Food was a major problem. We seldom carried lunch with us, and by the time we got home we were starving. Around this time my mother had twin babies, a girl and a boy. We named the girl Nthembwa and the boy Kapampa, meaning that the girl was older than the boy. My years at school, especially the first few years, were probably the unhappiest in my school history. My family, being so poor, could hardly afford to give me that most of my schoolmates were able to get from their parents. Maynard was slightly better off than I was. He had brothers and some relatives who in our society were considered well-to-do people, and these relatives could help him in a number of ways. The school fees were high at that school, and one year my school fees were paid in a rather unusual manner. Mr. Zelenge's cows had wandered into our garden and had trampled on some crops. My mother had run to report to Zelenge's wife, and Zelenge's wife welcomed mother with a couple of fists. My mother had run to the court clerk to sue Mrs. Zelenge. A week later I had my school fees paid, and my mother could be seen displaying her new cloth. It was, I think, April. We were sitting in the classroom doing our arithmetic. I had wanted to go to the lavatory for a long time, but the teacher would not give me permission. "May I go to the lavatory now, sir?" I would ask again. "Not yet," he would say. "Finish your work first." "I have finished now, sir," I was able to say at the end. "Have you really? Begin the next page." Without his permission I could not go, and when he finally gave me permission I really went. I jumped out of the room in time, but no sooner had I started running to the lavatory than I was already helping myself. By the time I got to the lavatory, I was ready to turn back and go to the classroom. But could I? It was raining that I was, a blanket about a foot long and a foot wide given to me by a friend. It was all a mess. I could have gone behind the lavatory and run home, 8 miles away, in that condition, or I could have run down to the stream and dipped myself into the water. But I did neither. Another boy coming from the other classroom came running, and when he saw my trail on the ground, he made a hideous scream and the school was out. When all the pupils were about to gather around me in some kind of an amazement, I almost smiled as if to suggest that these things are common and can happen to any person, but I was utterly ashamed. I looked like a little bird in its nest on a rainy day. It trembles as though it is running short of breath. My God, one teacher was able to gasp. "Go wash yourself in the stream," my teacher commanded. I did. I quit school because of this incident. I was the subject of a talk at school that week. People started their conversation in my name. "Did you smell him that day?" Or, "What do you think of?" I quit school, and neither my father nor my mother would force me to go to school now. I was not going to go. No, not to that school. One of my mother's cousins, Kayiras Kafunda, had 2 wives. One of his wives, Nyamukwasi, was pregnant, and while I was staying home after quitting I was allowed to sleep in her house so I could make fire for her at night. Kayiras himself went to sleep in his other wife's house. One night I was awakened by my mother. "Get out," she said. "There is a snake in the house." "Give me a stick and I will kill it," I said, not knowing very much what I was talking about. "You don't kill snakes. Come on, let's get out." I went into the other house and slept there. The next day I was interested to know that there had never been a snake in the house that night. They did not want me to see the stork deliver his package to Nyamukwasi. I noted 27 down the berth, in case at some future time the boy should ask us when it was that he was welcomed into the world. May 13th. 1952. Before the end of May, my father received a letter from the headmaster. He asked me to read it, and I told him that the headmaster wanted to see my father at school. Actually, the letter said that my father was being sued for neglecting to send me back to school. In a week or so, he appeared before the court, a local court about 300 yards away from the school. He was fined 5 shillings, but he could not pay it. He was to be detained at court and work there until he was able to pay the fine. Our village headman loaned him 5 shillings, and he was out of trouble. When he got home, he raised hell on me, and that is how I was finally sent back to school. But the following year I was stranded again. I could not pay the school fees. However, this time the headmaster promised father he would pay my fees and have father repay him by installments. This my father did. My mother had a baby boy. We named him Zagora, meaning that those before him were twins. Then came another problem. My father began to feel uneasy about my well-being. During his beer errands, he would meet a good many people, his beer partners. These partners would whisper into his ears that if he let me go on with school, some people in the village would feel jealous and bewitch me. He had not, however, however, forgotten that only a short time back he was fined 5 shillings for neglecting to send me back to school. But he knew also that if I failed my examinations, I would not be permitted to go back to school except maybe under extreme conditions, such as if there were not enough pupils to constitute a class. This was his chance, he thought. One day he called me to him. Sitting on his stool, he began thus: "I fear they are going to kill you, my son, because you are passing all your examinations. Do you know what you should do?" "What?" "I am telling you that you should go and fail your forthcoming examinations. Write all the useless things you can think of and never give the right answers, and that 28 way you will fail, and nobody will bother to think of you anymore." "Oh, sure, I will," I promised him. My mother was completely disturbed about it, and she asked how he knew the witches, were haunting me because of my schoolwork. I was not going to stick to my promise, because for me examinations were competitions, the only times when I could also expect to stand on top of all or the majority of the pupils. I could decide purposely to fail my examinations, but I would be laughed at by many. I could decide to pass them, and I could be admired by many. I decided, going to pass them and be admired rather than ridiculed, and besides, I feared that everybody would not believe my failure. Then came that irritating routine. My sister and brother, the twins, were ill. My parents took them to the medicine man, the same medicine man, and still strange to say, it was again during the time when we began working in our gardens. This suggested right from the start that I would have to take care of the garden again, as I had done several years back. I was much bigger, and I could do it better and more efficiently, but I got to think of school too. Before, I was not at school, and I had all the time one could need, but I was small. Now, I was big and strong, but I had no time. I was going to work on Saturdays, and once or twice during the weekdays I was going to skip at school. The headmaster announced we were going to build 6 houses at school for boys whose homes were more than 6 miles away from school, so they could board there. This order affected me. In 1 week, we had all the 6 houses standing ready for occupation. The routine was that we would go home on Fridays to get more supplies and come back on Sunday night and board there. This left me with no time at all to work in the garden, and when I came back home on Friday, I had to think of preparing myself some flour to take to school on Sunday night. This was solved because my father's cousin's son, Legson was going to get me flour from his mother. When I learned that it was getting later and later for the garden to be finished in time for the rain, I quit 29 school for 1 week and worked in the garden, but I still did not finish it. Then one morning, all the people who belonged to the African National Church, the church my mother belonged to, picked up their hoes and came to our garden, and by noon of that day the whole garden was done and planted with maize. I returned to school the following week. I was a few minutes late the first morning and had to sit in the very back row of the big room during the morning prayers. "Let's pray," said the headmaster, and we all bowed down with our eyes closed. But some boys in the back row kept on whispering and laughing, and the headmaster opened his eyes stealthily to note the boys. The whole of the back row, he decided. "And in Jesus' name, amen," said the headmaster finally. "Will the boys in the back row come forward, please?" he commanded, and at the same time dispatched another boy to get some whips. We were standing in front of the whole school, and the whole school had already judged us mischievously for making noise during the prayers. The whips were brought in, and one by one the boys were being flogged. It was my turn to be flogged. "May I explain something, sir, before I get whipped?" I asked with my right hand raised up before the presence of the holder of the ultimate authority on the school grounds. "You may, sir," I began in trembling voice. I opened my eyes during the prayer, and I did so because I heard these people talk and laugh, and I wanted to see who were talking and laughing so I could report them to you, sir, at the end of the ceremony. "Very well," said the voice of one with authority. "Very well, go back to your seat." I had gone about 2 steps when that same voice of one with authority rang behind me. "Wait a minute. You were not at school all last week, and do you have any explanation?" "I'm sure you do. Let's hear it." 30 I stood at attention, my hand raised up, and I began to explain. "My family was not home, and I was left with the job of hoeing the garden. That's why, sir," I said. My explanation, he said, was satisfactory, but I was still going to be whipped because I had not asked his permission to stay away. The game we played most often at school was football, soccer, and in January 1953 my school went to play at the Enthalair School, some 20 miles away. The whole school went up there to cheer the players, and it was exciting to watch the 2 teams fight for their schools. Unfortunately, we lost the game. It was expected, however, because whenever we played Enthalier at Enthalier, we lost the game, and whenever they played us at Winya, they always lost. The next morning, we started walking back home by way of my village. As we were approaching my village, we could hear the drum. That same old drum that tells you right away that someone somewhere is dead. I was not surprised when I found a number of people at home, getting ready to go to the place where my ailing sister and brother were. I went with them and found it was Zgora who was dead. Again, I could not fail to recognize the similarities between the deaths of Kamuntu and Zgora. Whereas Kamunta died on Saturday morning, Zgora died on Saturday night. When Kamunta died, my family was staying away because my mother was ill, and when Zgora died, my family was staying away because Nthembwa and Kapampa were ill. And on both occasions, I had been left alone to till the garden, only to be helped at the end by the villagers. The following month, I volunteered at school to go along with 10 other boys to Bulambia, about 70 miles away, to get school supplies. I realized that it was going to be a rough hike, and that if my mother and father were home, they would never let me go. But I had never been up there before, and I was eager to see it. Besides, that was the school where those pupils who had completed the school I was then attending went, and it was within the realm of possibility that I would go there too upon the completion of my schooling at Winya. Also, 31 there were 2 boys attending that school from my village, and they were close friends of mine, and I was anxious to see them. We carried our packs of cornmeal and off we went. It took us 15 hours of walking before we finally got there. We were given our bundles of books to carry back to our school, and mine was one of the lightest, because I was the youngest of them all. It contained 9 dozen textbooks, 2 dozen notebooks, 1 dozen rulers, and 4 slates. It was the heaviest load that I had ever carried on such a long trip, and it was not very strange that I was the slowest of them all. The trip took us more than 15 hours to get back to our school. I stumbled on the way, dropped my bundle to the ground, and hurt one of my toes on the right foot. I picked up my load and I found that 1 slate was broken into numerous tiny pieces. My toe hurt terribly, my load looked heavier than it really was, and I was extremely tired. Too tired to walk something like a mile without stopping for a rest or 2. There were times when the other boys would leave me about 4 or 5 miles behind, and they would stop and rest while waiting for me, and when I arrived, they would start again. At times when they were thus waiting for me, one of the older boys would run back after me and carry my load to the place where the rest were resting. We got home late at night, and I immediately forgot all my tiredness and pain when I learned that my brother and sister were well, and that the family was back home. I had always used Didymu as my first name, but while I was attending Winya school, I noticed that most of my schoolmates had English-sounding first names. Also at that time I was learning English, and I took quite a pride in the few words that I had mastered so far, and I always boasted that I would learn as much English as possible, and so be able to speak it much better than those who were teaching me English. To satisfy my pride, I decided to coin an English-sounding name for myself. One other fact that prompted me to change my name was the fact that many people used to laugh at me. Didymu is also the name of Thomas, the doubting disciple, and so sometimes the other boys and girls referred to me 32 simply as one of the 12, meaning, of course, one of the 12 disciples, and sometimes they referred to me as Mr. River, meaning the river in which I was tossed when I was a baby and from which I got the name of Didymu. My grandfather had given me the name of Shalangani, which means useless or unintelligent, and I hated this name because I believed I was not unintelligent, at least not as unintelligent as the name suggested. One day when I was still thinking of getting myself an English-sounding name, the name Legson came into my mind. I had never known anybody who had this name, and I do not know anybody who has it, and I cannot say exactly why I stuck to this name and not another. Maynard, my friend, wrote on the walls of the houses in the village and elsewhere with a piece of chalk in big letters Didymu Legson, that is to say, Didymu becomes Legson. I announced that I would fight any boy or girl who called me Didymu, and I would be most pleased if all men and women in the village began calling me by the name of Legson. So, my name was changed, but my father always called me by my old name, and once in a while some boys would forget and call me by the old name, and this would result in fierce fighting. My brother and sister found it hard to pronounce my name, and they've always called me by the name that sounds Legson. Later on, when I began to understand very well the reasons why the British are in Nyasaland and what they are doing, I began to be more and more pleased if someone called me by my old name. I began to look upon anything English with some reserve. Didymu is the name, and the right name for me. It is African in every respect, and it has all the meaning a reasonable name should possess. I was born a proud African and was even a proud African name, but because of the foolishness that sometimes befalls some men's minds, I was inclined to change it and give myself some foreign name that was void of any meaning. My father was very right to call me Didymu and refused to call me Legson, and the very fact that my brother and sister found it hard to pronounce this foreign name indicates how really foreign it was. And who 33 would care to keep such a name? Yes, it was indeed an error that I so rushingly demoted my dignified and historical name. The following year, instead of going to school in Bulambia as was normally the case, we went to Enthalayer, where the senior class had just been introduced. This senior class was supposed to be put at Wenya, but for some petty reasons and after opposition to our side, the class was put at Enthalayer, and so Enthalayer automatically became a senior primary school while Wenya remained a junior primary school. There were no boarding houses at Enthalayer, and so we lived with families and went home once every 2 weeks. The headmaster, Mr. Morton Magogo, who is now a school inspector, was a very intelligent teacher, and we all liked him, although he often spanked us. During the first week of school, he announced that he wanted every boy at school to be in khaki shorts and a khaki shirt, and all girls to be in blue dresses. This was much more than my family could afford, and I knew very well that no matter how I tried to tell the teacher about my situation, he would not very likely understand me, as he had no idea at all about my background. All I was wearing at that time was an old piece of white cloth, which was so old and so dirty that it was no longer white and would never be white again no matter how much I washed it. As a matter of fact, it looked more like khaki than white, and the teacher at one time asked me if I could just make a shirt out of it. This would have been possible, but then I would have had no shorts to go with it, and it would have been senseless to wear a shirt without shorts, and besides, I used it as a blanket at night. Once again, I quit school for several weeks. One of these days when I was out of school and working in our garden, a man by the name of Elian Gambai, nicknamed Nairobi because he often talked about the days when he had worked in Nairobi, saw me and asked why I was not at school. He gave me a pair of khaki shorts and a white shirt and put me back at school again. While at that school, I was staying with a family about 200 yards from the school grounds. I was able to go home at noon and have lunch. The teacher gave us 34 nicknames, and mine was Girl because he claimed that I looked like a girl. During the first 3-week holiday, I went to Karanga Boma, a town, and worked. The following year found us at Wenya again, that is, the senior class that was transferred to Wenya, so that although both Enthalayer and Wenya were senior primary schools, Wenya was higher in that it had one class higher than Enthalayer. In summer of that year, I had worked at various jobs. I had worked at a dam, I had worked on the road, and I had worked in the gardens digging vans. The agriculture department demanded that people dig some sort of streams along or across their gardens. These streams were to be 1 foot deep and 3 feet wide, and were to collect the running water after the rains which otherwise would sweep away the soil. The owners of the gardens paid me for that. Then one day, late that summer, some men in the village were going to sell their cattle in the southernmost tip of Tanganyika, and they needed some boys or men who would help take care of the cattle on the way to that place, and then carry things they would buy there back to the image. This was a long journey, and they estimated it would take 3 to 4 weeks to get there, and about a week to get back. My father had thought of going with them, but he changed his mind because he was in the act of building a house, and moreover, my mother had had twins, one of whom was already dead, and the other, who was given the name of Masaida, meaning that they were born too, but the other one is dead, was herself in poor health. I was to go with them instead. There were 9 of us in all, and 2 of us, Diaford Nairongo and me, were to take charge of the 16 cows on the way. On a Monday morning, my father bade me farewell. We had been gone a week, when I remember one morning I woke up crying. It had been a cool night, and we had slept outdoors, not very near any village. Once at night the other men had waked me, saying that I was crying. I said I was not crying. I went back to sleep and got up crying. I had had a bad dream. I dreamed that my head had been shaved and that I had been crying in protest against the shaving of my head, when suddenly I 35 had seen in my dream an Ione man standing in front of me with his face turned away from me. I recognized this lone man to be my father. It was on Sunday, the Sunday following the Monday we left home, that my father, after a good drink of beer, went out into the woods to get himself some construction material. Away into the bush, far away from home, we were ascending and descending hills, and away in the woods my father was climbing a tree. Higher and higher he went until he could go no higher. He cut down some branches, and after dropping his axe, he began climbing down, but he had stepped on a dry branch which immediately broke, bringing him down with it. He fell on his branches, breaking his hand. A compound fracture. His other hand landed on the axe and was badly cut, and his head hit a rock and cracked. Heaven knows how long he stayed there unconscious. But he regained consciousness and staggered home, sobbing and crying as he staggered. He got home and was carried to a dispensary 8 miles away. He lived 3 days, then died. The men had sold their cows and they paid us 8 shillings apiece. With this money I bought myself a blanket. I thought my mother and father would be very proud to see me be the first member of the family to own a blanket, but only the grave of father did I find. I started a new garden not too far from our house. By the way, the house my father was building before he died was never completed. I had asked some friends to help me to do it because I was running short on time as the schools would be starting soon. I had climbed a tree to cut down some branches, and I narrowly escaped being knocked down by one of the branches as it came down. I came down too, and the other boys thought it would be a good idea if we did not climb trees. I was cutting down one tree while standing on the ground, and as I swung the axe, some little branches deflected it, and it came right on my right leg. I had cut myself, and I saw blood rushing out. I tied a string around my thigh so I would not lose much blood and slowly walked home, and one of the boys ran home to report my accident. A group of men, women, and children came running 36 to carry me home. My friend had exaggerated when telling them of my injuries, for upon hearing the report they thought I was in as bad a condition as my father when he fell off the tree, and that is the reason why the men and the women came to carry me home. My mother was weeping already before she saw me. I was taken to the same dispensary where my father had stayed during the last 3 days of his life. Only I did not stay there. I had not seen him when he lay in that dispensary after his accident, but from what I had heard, I knew that I was not even half as seriously injured as he had been, but my mother, who had seen my father in that condition and who saw me then, had a different idea. He fell off a tree, hurt himself, and died. She reasoned. I cut myself while felling a tree, therefore she concluded I was going to die. She hurried to a medicine man and asked his advice. This is a simple case, he told her. You see, his father and all his relatives now dead are sad because they think he is being troubled, so they want to free him of these troubles by letting him die. She came back more worried than she was before she went to him, for now she even blamed herself for having ever gone to consult him in the first place, because, she reasoned, she would have felt better if she did not know my fate. She even wished the doctor was not telling the truth. He had suggested to her that one remedy to this was that we should move from the area to some other place. I did not stay at the dispensary for long. I came home, and one more thing that still shook my mother, and this time, it shook me too, was an incident a short time after my accident. I was sleeping on the same mat with a nephew of hers. Chipimba was his name. We were both covered with the same blanket, and it happened that late at night there was a snake between us. As far as I can recollect now, it appears that my friend shook first and got bit on the back. Not knowing what had happened, he went out and sat on the veranda crying. When his mother heard him, she came out and asked him why he was crying. He could not tell. I heard them talking outside and I went out, leaving the blanket on the mat. Light was brought to check if there was anything there, because at 37 had been noticed that his back was swelling. A little black snake was lying on the mat under the blanket. It had bitten him, and at that hour of the night there was little they could do in terms of medicines. The little they did not help the matter, for it was not too long thereafter that our friend died. Our doctor suggested that we should move to another area, because he said there the spirit of any of my dead relatives would not find me. I was in my senior class, and soon I would be going to a secondary school, and secondary schools were far away. My mother was planning to move to some other area too, but I found it useless to run away because I said, if the spirits of my dead relatives are trying to haunt me, I cannot escape them by running away. You don't understand, responded my mother. Let's get out of this place while we have time. And what's it that I don't understand? What the doctor is telling us. He says we are all going to die if we don't move soon. I was not going to move because he told me so, I said. She was getting angry and she began packing. Why do you insist on staying here? She asked. But where are you going? I asked. You have a house here, a garden here, you have friends here, and now wherever it is that you are going, who do you think will build you a house? Who do you think will begin a new garden for you? I don't care. I don't care at all, she answered. You better care. You will not have a garden, and you will not have any food, and you will starve to death, and that will be the death your doctor is predicting. She cooled down and unpacked her things. We stayed there in our good old village, and we enjoyed our stay there as much as we could, much more than we would have we decided to move. Do you still want to move away? I asked her 2 years later. Oh, yes. I certainly want to move away, she replied, but I just do not know where to. 38. Is it not madness to run away from your good home because a witch doctor tells you to? I asked. It is indeed madness to stay there when he tells you to go, she said. That may be true, I said, but let us stay here a little longer. I am sure it will be all right. I sat for my final examinations that year, and I passed them. I had applied to a teacher's college, but was turned down because they said I was too young to be a teacher. I applied for a bursary or scholarship from my district, and they granted me £5 for my school fees at secondary school. But that was not enough. Maynard got help from his cousin who was then a teacher, and he was going to a secondary school. I just could not help thinking that I would have to loaf in the because I could go neither to a teacher's college because I was young, nor to a secondary school because I did not have enough money. But then, I had a very rare chance, a rare good fortune which Providence gives to few people in a long time. I received a letter from an Englishman named Petty, a missionary at Livingstonia Church of Scotland, an old and famous mission school in the country founded by Dr. Robert Laws during the latter part of the last century and named after the Scottish explorer, none other than David Livingstone, who traveled far and wide into the heart of Africa, exploring and pioneering for the abolition of the slave trade. It was in 1859 that the weary missionary, after a great deal of traveling, set foot in the southern part of what is now Nyasaland, thereby discovering Lake Nyasa. A little over a decade thereafter, Dr. Laws appeared in the country and established the mission school in the northern part of Nyasaland and named it after that famous missionary. The school started in poor buildings with only a few students, but in time Dr. Laws, with his untiring efforts, but new beautiful modern brick and stone buildings, which still retain much of their beauty and modernness. Many years after Dr. Law's death, the school developed into a secondary school, and the Reverend Petty was living at that school, although he was entrusted with the 39 affairs of the schools in the Karonga district whose headquarters was Livingstonia. I had seen him several times when he visited our school, but I had never been introduced to him, and really there was no reason why I should have been so privileged, so he did not know me. But I knew him. Only 3 years before, he had been instrumental in introducing Standard 4 at Enthalair School instead of at Winya, thus making Enthalair a senior school. Because of this, many of us in Winya looked to him with some indifference because we were never satisfied with the reasons why he and others had done so. But that year, this man we had been indifferent to was doing a favor for me, my village and my area, and possibly my country. After the final examinations, Mr. Petty, being in charge of the schools in my district, had a copy of the list of the names of those people who had passed, and when he saw my name high up on the list, he inquired what my plans were. The people he asked, who happened to know much about me, replied that I would be able neither to join the teacher's college because I was too young nor to enter a secondary school because of my financial incapability. Losing no time, he mailed a letter to me with a stamped and self-addressed envelope enclosed for my reply. I was very excited when I received the letter because at that time, I was not used to receiving any, and it was one of the few that I had received in my whole life. Actually, I had written and read many letters, not my letters, but letters belonging to those people who could neither read nor write. When such people received letters from their friends or relatives working or living in distant places, I was called upon to read them for them, and whenever they wanted to write letters to their friends, I was asked to write them. Taking a pencil and paper, I would write down what they dictated to me as though I were their secretary. But this letter was different. It was mine. I opened it with trembling fingers, wondering where it came from and what message it carried. I spread it open and began reading. Dear Legson, it began, you have passed your examination with high marks, and I understand you do not have money to go to a secondary school. 40. I talked to Mr. Russell, headmaster of Livingstonia Secondary School, and when he saw your marks, he immediately agreed to reserve a place for you here. I shall help you through secondary school so that you in turn will help someone." I read the letter over and over again, and I was filled with joy. Word passed round in the village that I was going to secondary school. Few congratulated me, and some went as far as commenting, "There is no end in learning. Why don't you just quit school now and get yourself a job and earn some money? You don't know when you will die. You might just keep on going to school and die without even making use of your learning." Others commented privately, "Do you know?" They asked one another, "Legson is going to a secondary school?" Legson and his friend Maynard. "Just imagine. They are very proud now, and how much prouder will they be when they come back? We won't even talk to them." As for Mother, this was nothing to be very excited about. As for me, it was just wonderful. I reflected on my life and saw a boy born of a poor family, marching on the road of poverty, the road on which thousands of millions of people had marched before me, and many more will march after me. But I saw myself as one of the very few fortunate ones of those millions of poor people, for although I was poor, I was permitted to go to school, and, what is more, I was even promised help to go to a higher school. Other poor people such as my parents were not even lucky enough to attend the very first grade, not even to learn to write their own names, let alone counting further than 20. But here I was, having been in school for over 9 years, and not yet satisfied with the little education I had so far acquired. Therefore, I would not lose such a great opportunity, the opportunity that happens to one sometimes only once. Mother would have been pleased to see me employed. Since my father had died, the family was, in a way, depending on me. I explained to her that if I went to a secondary school and got through all right, I would have a better chance of being employed, and not only that, but that I would also be in a better position at finding a better job with better pay. But to her it made no difference. Any job was like another, and it did not matter which one I took. However, she was soft and acting under pressure from those few people who understood what it meant to go for higher education. She let me accept Mr. Petty's help. Wasting no time, I hurried and borrowed an ink pen from a neighbor, and tearing a piece of white paper from an old notebook, I wrote to Mr. Petty, thanking him for his great kindness and assuring him that after my secondary school and when I got employed, I would do all in my power to help one or more who were in need. 3 days later, I received another letter, this time from Mr. Russell, the headmaster of the school, admitting me. The school was about 200 miles from our village, and both of us, Maynard and I, were to go there by bus. The mission, aside from operating the secondary and elementary classes, offered several other departments such as engineering and carpentry, teachers training, logical training, and medical training. Because of these various departments, several people in our village had gone there to receive one kind of training or another, and most of these people used to walk there. They had often told us about their troubles on the way, and also about the mission. One thing that they all agreed on, and which they all liked to talk about most, was that the place was very cold, and that it rained a great deal more and much more often than it did at home. Mr. Russell, too, in his letter had emphasized the same point, and he asked me and all other incoming students to bring raincoats as well as plates, forks, spoons, flashlights, and so on. But both Maynard and I were anxious to go and see for ourselves this famous institution of learning. We made all the necessary arrangements. Maynard bought himself a pair of canvas shoes, blankets, and a pair of short trousers. I still had my old blanket, the blanket I bought in Tanganyika when we went to sell cows, the same blanket that gave me the distinction of being the first member in our family ever to own a blanket. It was now old and no longer attractive, but I was still proud of it. I had bought it with my own money earned by my own labor and toil, and certainly it was worth being proud of. Mr. Harrison Kayiras, my teacher at Winya, gave me a pair of short trousers and 20 shillings for my bus fare to the school, and Mr. Kamalenj Kanyimbo, my father's cousin, who also had helped me in a number of ways before, gave me a white shirt. My mother prepared some corn flour and killed a chicken for my food on the way. We were going to walk from the village to Palamambo, a day's journey, then catch the bus to Mpachi and walk from there to the school, a distance of 18-odd miles. On the great day for our leaving, we washed ourselves and ate the food that our mothers had prepared for us. Then came the moment for our goodbyes. We were going to miss our families for 3 months, and then see them for 3 weeks if we were able to make it. My mother was sad to see me off, and she began giving me her last advice, the same thing she had been telling me all of the past week. "Now, my son," she began, "you're going to a strange place, and you don't know anybody there. When you get there, Don't fight with the other boys. Don't quarrel. Be kind to others. Help them and they will help you. And remember to write to us and leave all the girls alone. About a year before that, her cousin's son had died, and it was believed that he had gotten a disease from some woman when he was teaching in another district. This was what led my mother to say, "Leave all the girls alone." "Do you understand?" she asked. "I'll surely do," I replied. 43-inch, do not think this is a joke, she began again. "I am serious. If you fight, they will kill you. If you are kind to them, they will be kind to you. If you are friendly, they will be friendly to you. If you are mean to them, they will also be mean to you. And you know why your friend died." "I know all that," I interrupted her before she mentioned girls again. "I know all that," I repeated. "Yes," she continued, "you better know all this. I am doing this for your own safety and happiness. I am not the one who is going to suffer. You are the one who is going to suffer when you have no friends, or when no one will help you." "Mother," I said, "certainly I know all that, and do not worry about me. I shall remember all that you are telling me now. What else do you want me to remember? Just remember what I have told you. If you..." She began to say them over again, and I was getting tired of them and was already angry. "Well, if there is nothing else you want to add," I told her, "then goodbye." I picked up my things, and Maynard, who was also being told the same things, was ready, and off we went, and my mother still was shouting, "Don't forget." It was a long walk, and there was only one village between ours and the village where we were going to catch the bus. We hurried forward, now walking, now running, until we came to the inn between village around 11 in the morning. But we still had a long way to go. Through tall trees and tall grass, we passed. The sun set, the darkness spread, and we were still walking. It was around 11 at night when we finally reached our destination. The villagers welcomed us, and they said that we were very lucky that we did not meet any lions on the way. Just yesterday, one told us a lion was killed nearby, and today 2 lions were seen here. "You are very lucky, my boys, but please never travel at nighttime in this part of the country, and don't be out of doors at night." Late in the evening the following day, our bus arrived and took us to Roompi. Neither of us had been in a bus before, and we were very anxious to ride one, although we were a 7 little bit afraid of the bus because we feared it would crash any time, or, worse still, miss the bridges, in which case we would end up in the rivers. But the bus safely brought us to Roompi, then Tampachi, from where we walked to Livingstonia. The pair of shorts that Mr. Kayiras had given me were too big for my waist, and I feared that it would cost me a great deal of money if I sent them to a tailor and had him change them. An idea popped into my head: why not buy a belt? Long before the school opened, I went to the stores. To my disappointment, most of the belts I found there were very expensive. As a last resort, I looked around at the ladies' belts and saw a cheap green belt. If it can do the job as well as any other belt can, I thought to myself, I am buying it. And, sure enough, I bought it and wore it right there in the store and proudly marched out with a lady's belt around my waist. And whom did I meet outside? Mr. Petty. I introduced myself. "My name is Legson," I began. "Oh, how are you?" was the response. "I am very fine, thank you. How old are you?" he asked. He was speaking too fast for me, and I missed the word old, and thought he said, "How are you?" again. I wondered why he asked me the same question twice. So I answered again, "I am very fine, thank you." "Thank you," he said. "And how old are you?" Now I understood him. "I don't know how old I am, but I think I am 14, I said. "I will put you in school at 9, he said. The school was opening at 9 o'clock that morning, and I rushed to the dormitories so I could get ready. We had arrived there at night, and I had not seen all the students, but now in daylight I saw that there were many. One thing came into my head immediately: what will these people think of my lady's belt? And worse still, I noticed that over 3/4 of them had shoes on, and that I and the others were walking around barefooted. Nobody laughed at me for the time being, and we quietly went to the opening ceremony. Afterward we, the newcomers, gathered in one big 45.